Welcome to the GSC Grays Podcast. This podcast is for farmers, landowners, their advisors, and anyone with a general interest in agriculture. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be discussing the Sustainable Farming Incentive with Director Robert Sullivan. With BPS having a new payment rates and standards announced in January, and discussions around the loss of food production as a result of SFI, it's certainly something that will be at the forefront of many farmers' minds. During our discussion, Rob talks about some real-life examples of where SFI is making a real difference to the sustainability and profitability of enterprises. We look at some of the pitfalls and the reasons why it's really important to take good advice. And Rob also discusses some of the real advantages, including the fact that many farms are actually finding themselves earning more through SFI than they ever would have through BPS. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Rob. Rob, if you'd like to just give a little introduction to yourself for those who don't have the pleasure of already knowing you.
Just a little bit about myself. My name's Robert Sullivan, obviously. I'm a director of GSC Grays, having joined them 6 years ago, coming up 7 years ago. I'm a farm business consultant and I've been doing so for the last 30 odd years, too many years to remember really, and provide farm consultancy advice across the whole of the north of England, mainly focusing around the arable and lowland mixed farms, but also have experience of upland farms and hill farms as well, as my family are involved in those sort of businesses.
And Rob, I quite like to add a little personal component. Just what's your favourite thing about your role, or the best thing about your job, or the bit of farming that you're most interested in?
I think the main thing is actually the impact we can have, our advice can have on farming businesses. And over the years, there's been a number of occasions where I've helped farmers massively turn their businesses around for the better and ensure that they've got a long-term future both for themselves and for future generations.
Excellent. Okay, well, today we're here to talk about the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and hopefully there'll be some bits in there for those farmers who are looking for a sustainable future. Now, there's been a lot of talk about SFI recently with the new announcement on payment rates and different actions that they can apply for. Is now the time for farmers to be applying for SFI?
Right, in terms of the SFI element, we've got to think about last year's options and this coming year's options. Last year's options we know about, there's 23 of them. We can make applications now to actually make use of those 23 options. Recently, back in beginning of January at the Oxford Farming Conference, a new number of options were announced, along with the payment rates. They're going to come in some point in 2024. There's no actual certainty when that's going to be. The other uncertainty at the moment is we don't know what the actual rules or obligations will be for those options. So at the moment, we literally know the headline rates in terms of the name of the option and the payment rate, but nothing more than that. So the reality is, rather than sitting waiting for those to possibly come out some point later in the year, we certainly are advising clients to actually enter the SFI agreements now so that they can make best use of the options that are around currently, and then they can add to them in 12 months' time with the new options that are coming along whenever they actually do start.
Okay, so maybe we should take it back a step, because a lot of people will know what the Sustainable Farming Incentive is, but just to give people a flavour, what sort of activities can farmers get paid for under the SFI?
Right, in terms of the activities that they can get paid for, there is a series of types of activity, some of it related to soils, some of it related to integrated pest management, some related to nutrient management, but basically all of them are being paid to provide some form of public good to as a result of their actions that the farmers are going to get paid for. So it could be things in terms of actually registering what the soil health is, through taking some soil samples, through to producing nutrient management plans to ensure that the nutrients in the soil are being managed as effectively as possible, through to such things as wild bird feed or wildflowers or various options like that. So a plethora of different options are available at this moment in time.
Okay. And most of those are sort of environmental options?
Certainly there is going to be a benefit to the environment just about by all the actions that are coming about.
Okay. And then, so as a business, GSC Grays are providing farm business reviews, and actually we're also providing SFI reviews. We've seen a lot of farmers recently, and I suppose a question lots of farmers will be asking is, well, every farm's different, and who are the winners and the losers? Who are those who stand to benefit the most from SFI?
Right, in terms of the winners at this moment in time, certainly with the 2023 options that are around, there's certainly more options available for the arable farmers to actually make use of the various options available.
Interesting.
Less so for the grassland farmers, but hopefully that might change over time. And unfortunately, from what we are seeing is the guys that are farming in the hills, there's not an awful lot of options available for them at this moment in time. Again, potentially there are options coming along further down the line, both with SFI and hopefully countryside stewardship as well, but they are some point in the future rather than now.
And is that because a lot of them are already in countryside stewardship schemes?
Indeed, certainly the hill farmers, most of them are already in some form of countryside stewardship scheme or environmental stewardship scheme, and therefore a lot of the land has management prescriptions on them. So when you look at what's available under the SFI agreement, most of the agreements under SFI are going to be very simple because most of the land is not able to have any additional agreements on them at this moment in time.
Okay. But countryside stewardship isn't a barrier to applying for SFI, though. Those who are in existing schemes can also apply for SFI, is that correct?
Yes, in that respect, it is very much correct. Countryside stewardship scheme is there. Certainly you aren't going to be in a position where you're going to get paid twice on the same parcel of land for the same action, but there are opportunities for certain SFI actions to be added to the countryside stewardship management prescriptions that are already on place, so that there is additional payments available on the same parcel of land, partly coming from SFI, partly coming from countryside stewardship.
Okay. Would you be able to give an example of how that might work in practice?
Yeah, certainly. So an obvious one would be under countryside stewardship, you will have certain land that might be in a wildflower option or a wild bird food option. Under SFI, that land would also qualify for being able to receive a payment for not using any insecticides on that land.
Okay. And what about tenant farmers, Rob? Is there anything stopping tenant farmers from applying for SFI?
Well, it really depends on the length of the tenure that they might have. The SFI is only a 3-year scheme, so as long as they can commit to the fact that they've got occupancy of the land for at least 3 years, they are eligible to join the SFI. If they are for less than that, there will have to be some sort of arrangement with the landlord to enable them to go into that agreement. But anyone who's got occupancy for more than 3 years can go in without any obligations at all.
And how are we finding those discussions are going with landlords and tenants who are looking at SFI who don't have that length of tenure? Are they quite amenable to it, or is that something that's a bit different?
In general, there's been positive responses from the landlords that they fully accept that the basic payment scheme is obviously disappearing, so therefore that ability to generate some form of income off that scheme is disappearing. And this is an area where the farmer has the opportunity to generate some new income streams for that. And in general, the landlords are being positive in that respect.
Okay, well, that's good news. You mentioned earlier that we were encouraging people to apply now for the 2023 actions, but it's my understanding that a lot of farmers have been waiting to see kind of what's coming over the hill, for 2024, so that they understand the full set of options available to them, and then they might start SFI at a time which fits in with their rotations, etc. You said that you would encourage farmers to apply now. Now, just if you could maybe talk a little bit about how that works. Just, can they apply now and they can just top up with what's to come? It's a rolling application scheme, isn't it? And I think it's just to provide reassurance to those who are potentially thinking about it. It is okay for them to apply now. They're not going to lose out.
They're definitely not going to lose out. If you apply now, the scheme starts very soon after the application. Normally, or certainly what we've found for the ones we've done to date, the actual responses back from the RPA are normally within 3 or 4 days of the application being submitted. So therefore, the actual agreement becomes live very quickly. There's two elements to it. One is actually the immediate benefit to the farmer of applying now. If they actually have an SFI agreement that might be paying them, I don't know, £20,000 a year, say, 3 months down the line, 3 to 4 months down the line, they get their first payment. So they get the 25% of that. So in that instance, it would be a £5,000. They would get 3 to 4 months down the line. And then 3 months later, the next £5,000 comes along. So in terms of improving the cash flow, there's an immediate benefit to the farmer. My argument to the farmer is about saying, well, actually, let's wait until we see what's a little bit further down the line. You are missing out on money now. And the reality is cash is king. And it doesn't matter what business or what sector you're in, having an income stream that is suddenly generating more money through the summer period, in my mind, is actually very useful. So rather than actually waiting, it makes sense to go in. And the reality is, with the 2024 options, whenever they come about, they can be added in 12 months after you actually join the scheme. So the reality is you're never going to miss out. You're just going to be adding to it every 12 months.
Okay. Now, we've been hearing a little bit in the farming press about agricultural productivity and food production being impacted by the SFI. Could you explain perhaps why people are starting to believe that this might be the case?
It's mainly because people are looking at questioning, which is probably a good thing. They're questioning whether what they're doing is actually the most economically viable and sustainable way of farming the land that they're occupying. So for a number of types of crops, if we consider the arable side of things, which is where the reduction in productivity is really being talked about.
Right.
One option, legume fallow NUM3, is an option which people are seriously looking at, which provides a decent payment to the farmer for having the land in this particular option. And that's a guaranteed payment. Doesn't matter what Mother Nature throws at you, you are going to get paid that money as long as you meet the obligations of the scheme and put the option in the ground. When you've now got things like oilseed rape being questioned about its viability because of the impact with cabbage stem flea beetle and various things like that, slugs as well, and obviously the weather we've had over this last winter, that payment under the NUM3 is guaranteed. The payments from the crop side of things is still is considerably more risky, shall we say, and people are actually questioning how much of a risk they're prepared to take. And if they're not prepared to take that level of risk, then the NUM3 option is being considered by a number of people. It's always likely to be considerably lower paying than a very good crop of oilseed rape. But the reality is if you've got a poor crop of oilseed rape or a failed crop of oilseed rape, that is not going to pay you anything much at all. The NUM3 option will continue to provide you that income. So it's managing the risk of the farm rather than actually anything else that farmers on their individual levels are looking at, and that might impact on productivity or farm production over time.
Might be going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but it seems to me that a lot of the options through the transition are leading to farmers scaling back, and that scaling back out of perhaps necessity or looking at the economics of it, whereby they're trying to address labour shortages, they're trying to reduce the fuel that they're using, they're trying to reduce the machinery that they're using, and therefore they're looking to farm smaller parcels of land or take advantage of these schemes. And I guess a lot of people might be wondering, well, what's the future of kind of food production and self-sufficiency in the United Kingdom?
Well, I would look at it in a way that it's forcing farmers to become more business-minded. The reality is if you are growing a crop which is not actually going to generate you an adequate return to meet your obligations and generate sufficient profitability to ensure you can carry on growing it going forward, why are you growing that crop in the first place? And so therefore, if the economics of the crop, of growing a particular crop, are no longer there, then look at the other alternatives to how can you actually ensure that you've got a profitable business going forward. And for a lot of people, there might well be a combination where they can use SFI proactively within their farming business to ensure they have a viable future. Yes, it might mean that certain areas of the farm are less productive because they've put them into various other options, but actually conversely, it might mean that you can actually farm other areas of the farm more productively because you haven't got those awkward areas or those poor areas or those areas that always take an age to actually generate a seed bed, etc., and you can actually farm other areas of the farm more efficiently, more productively, and more profitably. So it's actually that there is an element of the more, so we say, the enlightened way of looking at it was how can you actually maximise the production on the best part of the land and probably accept that the poorer areas of the land, you're better off utilising the SFI and the payment you get there.
And lots of these actions will benefit the soil health anyway, so it's a win-win.
From the reality is that's the government policy. They are looking to try and ensure that there are improvements in soil health, biodiversity, and the environmental status of the countryside, and that's why they've chosen the options they've done. It's a question of the farmers taking those options and working out how they can best utilise those within their farming business to maximise their profitability. And there's various ways that can be done through making the right choices.
Okay. So are we saying that we think that SFI is better than BPS?
Personally, from my point of view, absolutely. The reality is BPS was a way of allowing less productive and less efficient farmers to remain within the industry. And whereas SFI, you are then having to make much more business-minded decisions as to whether you carry on farming the land in the way that you're farming it, or whether you're actually going to utilise the SFI options to maximise your financial viability, but also they've got the benefit of the environmental improvements as well.
Rob, you're involved in a lot of contract farming agreements. How is SFI going to affect those?
Yeah, certainly we are, as a firm, and myself in particular, are involved in a lot of contract farming agreements. And SFI certainly should be seriously being considered by all both sides of the contract farming agreement as to how that might impact on the overall productivity from those agreements. It all depends on the actual quality of the land and the amount and the likely yields that you're going to get from that land. If you're on a lot of the contract farming agreements in general are found to be on the more marginal arable land. Not all, but if we look at those in the first instance, because they are lower yielding land, the actual margins on a per acre basis for an individual crop, taking into account the contractor's fee and various things like that are not particularly great.
Okay.
So for a lot of those agreements, it will actually be more economically viable to actually not grow certain crops. So probably the second wheats, the winter barleys, possibly even the oilseed rape as well, because the margin that they are consistently getting from those crops might only be less than £100 an acre. Whereas under a SFI, you've got the immediate opportunity under legume fallow of getting a payment of £240 an acre, which is obviously considerably higher. Granted, there are costs off that, but the reality is the margin from that particular option is going to be significantly higher than for those lesser crops, shall we call it. That will then lead to a further benefit in the fact that if you use the legume fallow properly, you are then able to grow first wheats again on a more regular basis. The first wheats are almost certainly going to be a crop that will generate you a strong positive margin. So you get the best of both worlds in terms of you're not receiving, or you're receiving the crops where you're receiving very little margin are no longer in the rotation. They've been replaced by something that's giving you a guaranteed certain margin. And then the crops that actually do provide you the margin, you've probably actually increased the amount of those that are grown across the whole area by removing those other crops. The other benefit to the contractor, the contract farmer, not the contractor, the contract farmer, is the fact that the amount of land that he is then having to finance in terms of covering the cost of the seed, the fertiliser, the sprays, the working capital for the contractor's fees has reduced dramatically because he's only farming a smaller area of the crop, of the land. On the better farms, where the yields are consistently higher, so where you're able to do 4 tons of wheat, 1.5 tons to 2 tons of winter oilseed rape, you're probably going to be a little bit more circumspect about how much you use SFI for, because the margins are that much better in the first place.
Yeah.
So where there is an obvious benefit of using NUM3 over winter barley, winter oilseed rape possibly, that is probably not going to be there on the high yielding farms. So it's more a question of managing your risk across the rotation. And yes, you might still use some of the SFI options, but probably to a lesser extent, because the productivity from the farming activities themselves are still leaving a very good return.
Okay, so we're not going to see an exodus of contract farmers because of SFI?
No, I actually think it might actually help the returns to the contractors.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, all they're doing on the land where the margins are very tight, they are turning their money over. They're not actually making any money on that land. They are covering their costs. So if those areas are reduced and they are being paid to actually provide services to maintain the SFI options, you know, putting the seed in the ground, topping them, whatever it might turn out to be, and the farm, the land that they are actually farming is actually giving them a much bigger return anyway, they are likely to be more financially better off from that agreement, albeit maybe not doing as much physical work on the ground.
Okay. So as a business, we've done quite a lot of SFI reviews. What are, if any, obvious pitfalls or things that people need to be aware of when entering into the scheme?
Pitfalls. I think one of the things is actually an element of confusion about some of the rules and some of the options. A lot of people at the moment are in a situation where, because of the wet weather we've had over the last 6 months, a lot of the land is actually either not drilled or has failed. And so therefore people are questioning what they are wanting to do or what they should be doing with that land. And a lot of them are suddenly thinking, well, actually SFI might be an option. And actually the legume fallow we've talked about previously might be the obvious option. The reality is under the SFI, you have to meet the aims of each option has an aim, and you have to meet the aim. They're pretty relaxed about how you achieve it,
Okay.
but the aim has to be met. So under the legume fallow option, for example, you have to be able to show that the legume fallow has produced flowers in late spring and into the summer. So if you're at a situation now of thinking, actually, I can put some legume fallow in now and actually then pull it out again in the autumn before you then sow it into winter wheat again, you will not actually meet the aims of the scheme, and therefore it is really very risky from your point of view that you actually put that option in the ground. The reality is actually under the terms of the agreement, the SFI, the legume fallow, has to be sown within the first 12 months of the scheme. So you should be considering where, if you are going to use it, where you might want to use it this autumn and sow it this autumn, rather than actually worrying about it being an option that you might be able to utilise this year. If you go in now, but you don't put the SFI until the autumn, you are still going to get your money now, or whenever it becomes due after 4 months, and then 3 months, and 3 months, and 3 months. So the reality is you don't want the tail to wag the dog, as it were, in terms of doing something now, because that could impact further down the line detrimentally, and you actually suddenly found you haven't got the flexibility that you were expecting this autumn because of what you've committed to now.
Yeah, and it could be quite an expensive mistake to
Absolutely,
make. Yeah,
absolutely. So the reality is, in situations like that, with my agronomy hat on, I'm actually suggesting to people actually just using something cheap like mustard to sow into these areas. If you decided that you are not going to sow a spring crop now, it'd be better for you to actually put that, sow it with some mustard. It won't be very expensive and it won't cost you an awful lot. And then make sure that the land is right for the autumn to either go back into a crop or go into an SFI option at that point.
Okay. And what about, so we've talked quite a lot about arable businesses. What about sort of upland, livestock, dairy? Is there anything that we're seeing in those sectors?
A lot of interest in the herbal leys. That's probably the main option that people are looking at, where they are going to get a decent payment for actually putting herbal leys in the ground. What I would advise farmers there is actually don't just look at the payment. The payment is great. You know, it's going to be £150 an acre or thereabouts. per year, which is a decent payment in the first place. What I would say is if you're actually going to go into that option requires a totally different type of management of the grassland and the production from that grassland than is the case with a normal ryegrass sward or a ryegrass clover sward. So if you are thinking this is a means to an end to just get a decent payment and that's it, and you're just going to carry on as normal, you will be cursing yourself in 12 months' time because
Right.
the production from that sward will have just disappeared because you've destroyed it yourself. You have to change your methodology of managing that grassland to ensure you get the production out of that sward going forward. If you're not prepared to do that, I would question whether you should go into it at all, because you'll probably end up with lower production than what you're used to at the moment, but you're getting a payment for it.
Okay. That leads me nicely into my next question, which is, in theory, farmers should be able to apply for all of these standards themselves. That's kind of the aim and the ambition of DEFRA when putting the SFI together. However, we're encouraging people to seek advice, and we're providing the SFI review. And I think you've outlined quite nicely a couple of examples of where this insight's really invaluable, but I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
Well, yeah, it's basically it's more the fact of what we're finding is if you're not careful, you could be applying for things which causes you problems 6 months, 12 months down the line, or actually how you actually apply for things. So other examples would be considering about if you're going to go down the route of not using any insecticides, that starts from day one. So you've got to be careful. So if the SFI is starting on, say, the 1st of March, the next 12 months from that time, you are not allowed to use any insecticides on that particular field parcel. If you're intending that field parcel to go into, say, an oilseed rape crop this autumn, where you might be wanting to use an insecticide, if you've actually pressed the button to say you're not going to use an insecticide on that field, that then means that you can't use an insecticide in the autumn. So it's basically it's taking all that into account when you're actually working things out.
Okay.
That is more problematic, and it isn't just straightforward.
No.
So
because it's bespoke, isn't it? So really what we're looking to do is support businesses to how to integrate this into their existing agricultural business so that they can continue to be kind of profitable and sustainable, so that it works with what they're already doing or what they're looking to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years.
it might not be just what they're already doing. It might well be they might have to tweak things what they're doing on the ground. So another example there is SAM2, which is the multi-species winter cover crops. As it stands at the moment, most people at the start of the scheme would say, well, actually, that means you have to sow a cover crop this autumn. Well, the reality is, and within the rules that have been confirmed by DEFRA, if you actually sow some bean seed in with a field of winter wheat, that is sufficient to actually enable you to claim it as a multi-species winter cover crop, for which you get paid £129 a hectare, £50 an acre. The management of that is relatively straightforward, in the fact that you would put on the same herbicide program that you would do in the autumn, and then after the end of February, you would then look to take the volunteer beans that are within that that's part of the cover crop out of the wheat crop, and then you continue to manage it as a wheat crop. So there's various other options like that where slight tweaks to what you're doing can suddenly enable you to get quite a significant payment back.
Right.
And it's those tweaks and those how you actually manage that within your rotation. That's where we add the value to those discussions.
Okay. Some say that SFI in some instances can be more profitable than BPS. Is that true?
Profitable is probably not the right word, but in terms of the amount of money that you're actually able to achieve, that is certainly the case. It probably is as a result of you radically changing your business. So an example of one I've done myself, 250-acre farm. The farmer is in his 70s and he's got no succession. This family are like the farm, but they are away and got their own careers, and he is physically struggling to do as much as he did. He's looking at using contractors more, and we've done the sums. And by the time he's paid the contractors to grow his crops of winter barleys, winter wheat, oilseed rape, it's actually more cost effective for him to actually go into into a number of the SFI options. So actually, this will be his last harvest, and he will be moving all his land into various SFI options. And as a result of that, his income will be probably getting on for 3 times what he got from the BPS.
Oh my goodness.
But he's no longer actively farming, physically growing crops.
Okay. And then I suppose that raises questions, doesn't it, as to if they're not actively farming, they won't necessarily be guaranteed the tax benefits that arise for those who are actively farming.
This is a bit of an unknown question at this moment in time. Treasury has not actually given an indication as to how that would be looked at. More so because of the landscape recovery type options under ELMS, where massive areas will be coming out of production. The reality for this particular gentleman, it's a 3-year agreement. So after 3 years, he could quite actually go back into it and be farming every single acre again. Actually, after 12 months, he could actually be farming 50% of it again, because all the options will actually allow him to reduce the area that he is able to he claims under that option down to 50% of the actual initial area that he put in his scheme. So therefore, he could be actively farming again in 12 months' time, should he wish to do so. So there is this uncertainty about how government might treat it from a inheritance tax point of view.
Okay.
From his point of view, his reality is he needs the money now. He's not worried about the impact on the next generation, because it's him. It's his retirement basically that he's looking at.
Yeah.
He's needing a source of income, and therefore he's chosen to go down that route.
Yeah. Okay. And that's interesting, because I suppose there's quite, when you look at the age demographic of farmers, he won't be the only one who's in that position.
Indeed.
So using that example, Rob, my question to you is, the SFI is guaranteed for 3 years. It's a 3-year agreement. But looking at the bigger picture, there might be a change of government over the next couple of years, and that pot of money is not safeguarded in the way that it was when we were part of the European Union. What would our advice to farmers be, looking at that bigger picture of what they need to do to ensure their farming, the sustainability of their farm for the long term, not just the next 3 years?
The reality is you can only deal with what's in front of you. Yes, it's only here for 3 years. Who knows what's around the corner? We could have had this same conversation about BPS 10 years ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is this is an option that you've got where it could work in your favour from a financial point of view. Certainly the vast majority of options are probably going to leave your land in better fettle than it might well be at this moment in time. So that's a positive thing for some point in the future. But the reality is if it's economically sensible for you to go down this route at this moment in time, personally, I would be looking to deal with the here and now, rather than the possibility of, well, it might be a different thing 3 years down the line. Going back to my client who's 74, well, 3 years down the line, he'll be 77. He's going to be less concerned about it than he probably is now. So it's dealing with the here and now. Yes, it is only a 3-year commitment. My also argument would be is if you actually listen to the politicians of whatever hue they might be, they are all thinking along the similar sort of lines. So whilst the payment rates might change or the amount of money in the pot might change, the actual direction of travel seems to be fairly well set.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Rob?
Final thoughts. It's worth considering SFI. Definitely worthwhile going through the process of having a look at it. It might well not be for you, but I think there is certain elements to it where people will be able to get benefits for doing things that they are probably doing already. A well-managed farm is actually doing a number of the options that you are being offered payments for. So as a bare minimum, that would make sense to at least cover some of your costs on that side of things. It's actually also looking at the options and how you can use them to work to your advantage. It might only be to say, right, well, actually, if we go back to my example of the beans and the wheat, it's a means to an end to generate you £50 an acre. if that's, that might be the only reason you are doing it, but that enables you to generate more money for doing very little different. So it's actually looking for the easy wins, the options that actually can be incorporated into your business with as little impact as possible, but to generate a decent financial return back to you. Worthwhile considering.
Okay. So thank you very much, Rob, for taking the time to talk to us today about SFI, bringing all of your experience to bear and hopefully giving the people listening some really good insight into what they can expect and why they should apply. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, there will be another one in a fortnight's time. So tune in to hear more about our farm business advice service, where we have seen nearly 1,000 farmers across the north of England, and we'll be looking at some interesting trends and case studies with director Greg Ricketts and managing director Guy Coggrave. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.